Good evening, everyone, and you are more than welcome to join us here at the Irish Women's Lobby, where we are absolutely delighted to be gathering for our second webinar, Speak Up for Free Speech. This evening, we have three wonderful speakers joining us to discuss the issues of cancel culture, hate speech, and the whole issue of freedom of expression itself. We have three speakers, as I said: Lisa McKenzie, Isolde White, and Megan Murphy, and we are so happy to have them joining us here this evening. First up, we are going to have Lisa McKenzie, and Lisa is a communications specialist. She's a member of the Scotland-based policy analysis collective, Murray Blackburn McKenzie. This collective offers independent, fact-based analysis with a particular focus on women's rights and the impact of gender self-identification on women's sex-based rights also. Lisa is a former civil servant in the UK government, where she worked as a government communications specialist in a number of Whitehall departments, including the Department for Social Security and Home Office, as well as the Commission for Racial Equality. She was seconded to the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food during the 2001 foot and mouth crisis and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So you can see she's a really comprehensive resume there with working for the government. After returning to Scotland, she's worked as a freelance researcher for the Scottish Parliament Futures Forum, and she was policy and public affairs advisor to penal reform campaign group the Howard's League in Scotland for 5 years. More recently, she worked for the Royal College of Nursing, and she has a degree in modern Chinese and an MSc in policy studies. As part of her role in McKenzie Blackburn McKenzie, Lisa has spoken and written about the legislative processes that particularly impact on women, including hate crime and hate speech legislation, as well as on the impact of the Yoga Carta principles on women's sex-based rights. This is, of course, particularly important in light of the recent acknowledgement by one of its architects that women's rights were not considered, not even in passing, when the principles of the Yoga Carta document were being drafted. So we're absolutely delighted to welcome Lisa here this evening, and she will be giving a presentation discussing the recent events in Scotland regarding hate crime and hate speech. Thank you, Lisa. Really looking forward to hearing your contribution. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Christine. I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. As you've alluded to, I'm going to talk a bit about hate crime legislation, which has just passed in the Scottish Parliament, really just in the last few weeks. So I'm going to reflect on that, and particularly the implications for women's rights and particularly freedom of speech. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope everyone can hear. Here we go. Okay. So the legislation that we're talking about is the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. And as I say, it was passed just the second week of March, so it's only just become enacted in the last week, in fact, although it's not yet in force. And what I'll do is I'll speak about the content of the bill, the context of the wider debate about sex and gender identity in Scotland and the UK generally, the concerns that were voiced about the impact of the bill on women's rights, but also the process of making the legislation, because I think the process itself showed something about the problem at heart here and the impact on women's rights. So that a bit of background here, every manifesto in 2016 obviously carried a whole range of commitments, and the governing party in Scotland are the Scottish National Party, and they didn't win a majority in 2016, but habitually supported by the Scottish Green Party, so they often have the arithmetic to get their bills through. But there was no commitment in that manifesto to advance hate crime legislation. However, they brought it forward. There had been an independent review of hate crime law by Lord Bracadale, a senior judge, which led up to that point. And the legislation was introduced to the Parliament on the 23rd of April last year. Now, I'm sure that will instantly lodge in your minds that this was just a few weeks after lockdown and the arrival of the COVID pandemic in Scotland and the UK. And the main aims of the bill were to abolish the offence of blasphemy, which is a long-standing offence, which is largely seen as obsolete. But the headline really was to modernise, consolidate and extend hate crime laws. And what you heard an awful lot from government ministers was that this is about sending a strong message to victims, perpetrators and communities and wider society. about the harms of crime that was motivated by hatred towards particular groups. So there are two types of hate crime that were within scope of the bill, and there's something called the statutory aggravation model. So that's where you have a baseline offence. So you have to have committed a regular crime. So let's say assault. But what makes it a hate crime is when you can prove that the perpetrator was motivated by hatred towards a particular, but someone who they believed or who they believed was in a particular protected group. And until this year, those groups had already been defined in pre-existing hate crime legislation, and those are people who had the protected characteristic of race, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and disability. The second type of crime, which was legislated for in this bill, was what's called stirring up hatred. And in Scotland, until last month, you could only stir up racial hatred. In England and Wales, you could stir up hatred on the basis of religion and sexual orientation. But in Scotland, the only thing on the statute books was stirring up racial hatred. And what the Scottish Government said at the point that it published the bill also was that it would set up a working group to consider a standalone offence of misogyny. And you'll hear me speak in a minute about the non-inclusion of sex as a protected characteristic, and therefore the women not coming in the scope of the bill. So the Scottish Government has set up a working group which is being chaired by a leading QC, Helena Kennedy, and that group has already started its work. So this bill provoked an incredible response. There were 2,000 submissions to the Scottish Parliament's Justice Committee. The Justice Committee were charged with scrutinising the bill, so they were the lead committee in the Parliament that looked at the legislation. And this was the highest number of submissions of any bill in the 22-year lifetime span of the Scottish Parliament. So this was really a sign of the level of concern and controversy associated with the proposals in the bill. And there were two main areas of concern voiced by grassroots women's groups. And I say grassroots women's groups because we do also have a cohort of women's groups in Scotland which are heavily funded by the Scottish Government, and they largely supported the proposals in the bill with very little dissent. But the newer groups, For Women Scotland, WP UK, some of them will be familiar to people on this call, they had two main concerns. And the first one was the non-inclusion of sex as a new statutory aggravator. So in the last slide, you saw me talk about the new protected characteristics which were being added, but sex was not one of them. So effectively, that meant that women would not be covered. So if you committed an assault against someone who you were motivated to assault because you believed they were gay or because they were Black, that would be regarded as a hate crime. But if you had assaulted someone on the basis that it was motivated by hatred towards women, that would not be covered. So that was one particular concern from these women's groups. But probably the bigger concern was the impact on freedom of speech rights of the proposed new offence of stirring up hatred on the basis of transgender identity. And we'll obviously talk a bit more about that. I will, and then no doubt we'll hear about more of that in discussion. But the freedom of speech concerns were pretty widely shared, and that's what was quite striking. In that they were voiced by a wide range of stakeholders, ranging from the Catholic bishops, the Evangelical Alliance, to the National Secular Society, the Society of Sikh Organisations, the Scottish Police Federation, the Scottish Newspaper Society, the BBC, artists, theatre directors, the Index on Censorship. There really was an incredible an alliance of people who were concerned about its implications for freedom of speech. And again, fairly unparalleled in the lifetime of the Scottish Parliament, particularly when you saw such strange bedfellows in the form of some of the faith groups and then the secular society all coming together on this one issue. But to talk quickly about the sex aggravator, so adding sex as a protected characteristic as a statutory aggravation. So clearly one of the big messages from the Scottish Government about this legislation, as I said at the beginning, was that these hate crime laws send a message that hatred towards particular groups is unacceptable. And obviously, every time you add a new protected group to the list, it makes it more and more obvious who's missing. And so it was quite stark that sex was not to be added to the bill. Now we can have a separate discussion about the merits of the aggravation model and using a sex aggravator or a misogynistic crime and its effectiveness in dealing harms that impact on women. But it was very stark that women were missing from this bill. And I mean, in the next slide, I'll show you an advertising campaign the Scottish Government has been using for the last few years, which was targeted at hate crime. And it's very stark that you can see that women are just not there. But the thing that my colleagues and I had argued was that if you added sex as a statutory aggravator, that gives you the capacity to record crimes which are motivated by hatred towards women. I mean, that I've got on this screen. So at the time the bill was going through, there was a case in Edinburgh in the High Court of a young man who had been alleged to be plotting a terror attack, and it was thought to be motivated by incel sympathies. And of course, we're seeing more and more of that across the world, young men caught up in online communities. And this is clearly an example of misogynistic motivation. As it happened in this case, he was convicted, but the incel motivation was not proved. But had it been, you might have marked that down as being aggravated on the basis of sex, for example. And we also heard from Muslim groups who gave evidence to the Parliament that often hate crimes perpetrated against Muslims were particularly targeted towards Muslim women. So again, you would have been able to capture data on not just hate crimes against Muslims, but against Muslim women. So there were some advantages to having the aggravation. And the other thing that the aggravation does is it's taken into account at the point of sentencing. So you might receive a more harsh sentence, for example. And this is an example of the Dear Haters campaign that ran first in 2017. It was jointly run by the Police Scotland and Scottish Government. And these posters were really widespread all over city centres. And again, when you look at these posters, you can see, well, who's not there. So what they're saying is, racism, transphobia, homophobia, these are all the unacceptable forms of hatred, but women are missing. And so the symbolism there is, again, quite powerful. So moving on to the stirring up hatred offences, as I said at the beginning, there was, up until last month, the offence of stirring up hatred on the basis of race, and that applied in Scotland. And at UK level, you also had religion and sexual orientation. But this bill in the Scottish Parliament created new offences of stirring up hatred on the basis of religion, sexual orientation, disability, transgender identity, age, and variation in sex characteristics, which is another way of describing those with intersex or differences sex development conditions. In the UK legislation, they have very strongly worded freedom of expression clauses in that bill. So it gives real protection to people who, well, as you can see in the top wording there is the freedom of expression protection for religion. So stirring up hatred on the basis of religion is criminal. However, as you can see there, you can go as far as to express antipathy, dislike, ridicule, insult, abuse of particular religions. So it gives quite a lot of protection there. And in fact, this bill, when it was going through Parliament in the early 2000s, was challenged by Rowan Atkinson, the actor and comedian, because he was really concerned that without these kind of protections, it would be very difficult to do comedy, for example. So there was quite a lot of debate about freedom of speech when that bill went through, which is what ended with this fairly strongly worded clause. And then you have a clause on sexual orientation, which is not quite as strong, but again, gives some protection there to individuals who might want to voice concern or dissent from received ideas about homosexuality. And these sorts of clauses were not in the Scottish draft bill at the beginning. So to kind of go to the process as the bill went through Parliament, stage one is the first stage, and that, as I said, involved 2,000 written responses from organisations and members of the public, and this is fairly unusual and unprecedented. There were 5 oral evidence sessions, and the photo down the side are photos of those who gave evidence, and that was generated by For Women Scotland to make the point that you can see right away that women are in a minority there. Now, obviously, the committee itself has a limited amount of control over which organisations send which individuals to give evidence, but certainly when I scanned the list, did a quick bit of maths, could see that of the 37 witnesses, only 10 were female. So here was a bill that had real ramifications for women, but women's voices were crowded out by men's voices, which is obviously not unheard of. There was a debate in the chamber, which is normal. And in all, stage one involved about 18 hours of public discussion. And the Scottish Government did concede that there were a lot of concerns about the bill that it would address at the next stage in the parliamentary process. And in fact, the bill did go through quite a lot of change that went through Parliament. And in and amongst the evidence was lots of evidence from grassroots women's groups, so Women's Race UK, For Women Scotland, LGBT Alliance. My colleagues and I put in evidence, resistors, and we came to them with mounds of evidence of women being accused of being hateful, groups being accused of being hate groups, for stating very basic facts about biology, about women's rights, about women's sex-based rights. And the Times article on the right is about some stickers that appeared on campus at the University of Edinburgh, which said woman, adult, human, female. And an activist group had encouraged people to report those stickers to the police. And in fact, the principal of the university himself had said that when it came to his attention, he also brought these stickers to the attention of Police Scotland. So we're trying to tell MSPs that women are already being accused of stirring up hatred, of being hateful, for making very basic statements, which are frankly uncontentious for most people. So at stage 2 in the Parliament, that's when the bill goes into what's called the committee stage. And this is when the really close scrutiny, the real kind of detailed looking at the different clauses takes place. And a whole load of different amendments were tabled by MSPs on the Justice Committee. So Labour MSP Joanne Lamont, she tabled various amendments, for example, to add sex to protected characteristic. A number of opposition MSPs tabled amendments on freedom of expression. There was also what was called a probing amendment, where we wanted to try and find out the government's rationale. So the definition of transgender identity in the bill was fourfold. So it said, I can't remember the exact wording, but male to female, female to male, non-binary persons, and people who cross-dress. So they had specifically picked out people who cross-dress as a distinct group under transgender identity. So that was contested too. And these were some quite difficult sessions for the minister. And again, I've used a screen grab of a news article that appeared after one of the sessions, where he was asked about non-binary and what it meant, and for a working definition, which he'd failed to give an answer to in a parliamentary question the year before. And he absolutely steadfastly refused to answer the question about whether there were two sexes. So this is really quite a troubling moment when a government minister is not prepared to defend human sexual dimorphism in a parliamentary committee. So this was a moment when there was a bit of a dawning of realization for women's groups, what we were up against. So there were 4 amendments were tabled on freedom of expression. Humza Yousaf is the minister, and he produced the amendment, which will be on your left on the screen, I think. And it's fairly generic. So this was trying to give a little bit of protection for the offence of stirring up hatred on the basis of transgender identity. And on the right, you've got an amendment from a Conservative MSP, Liam Kerr, where he's going into quite a lot of detail about the sorts of things that should be permissible to say without it being regarded as stirring up hatred on the basis of transgender identity. Now, these are fairly innocuous statements, discussion, criticism, rejection of concepts or beliefs, questioning whether someone should undergo a process for gender reassignment, stating that sex is a biological characteristic, there are 2 sexes. So what was fascinating was these amendments were tabled and they went on the Parliament website. And then, needless to say, there was a backlash on social media. And the night before the MSPs were due to meet, the government minister said that he'd met the various opposition MSPs and they had all withdrawn their amendments. So this is the tweet thread that he put out at 6 o'clock the night before the session. And he said he had met with the other MSPs and they'd all agreed to take down their amendments so they would not be discussed at committee. And on the right-hand side, you have the leader of the Green Party saying that he was very pleased to see this development and that these were shockingly overt homophobic and transphobic amendments. So this was quite a shocking moment because stage 2 is the stage of the bill where you really go into a lot of detail and you drill down and you try and thrash out some of the arguments and some of the rationale underlying parts of the bill. And that discussion was now put out of the public domain. And the minister said that what would happen is they would meet separately, these MSPs, in a private room to talk about them. So this is moving away from the sunlight of democracy into a private room to talk about these really important clauses, which would have real ramifications for women. And quite evidently, the chair of the committee found this in itself quite shocking. And he said this at the end of the committee session. He said he felt a little afraid. He felt afraid to have seen the reaction to what he believed were quite innocuous statements in those draft amendments. So this was quite shocking to women working on these issues, that a government minister was not prepared to defend a very simple amendment, and MSPs were too nervous to even debate what constituted transphobia. And this had come as a shock to the chair of the committee. And then this then led to them convening an extra evidence session at the end of stage 2. So they scheduled an extra session which hadn't been built into the parliamentary timetable on the 22nd of February, and this focused exclusively on the freedom of expression amendments. There was a 4-day consultation period, so it was opened up on the Friday, and over those 4 days, there were 681 responses. So again, this is absolutely off the scale stuff. And then after the 4-day consultation period had finished, there was a 90-minute oral evidence session, and women and other groups returned to give further evidence on the issue of freedom of expression. And this was attended, there were 13 witnesses in total, the Justice Committee, MSPs, and the Minister himself. Women were at pains to bring to the table as much evidence as they could about what's been going on and who's being accused of hatred for, again, things that are quite obvious statements of biological fact. And we talked about Lydia Falcon, the Spanish feminist who had been pulled into the prosecutor's office on her 85th birthday to be questioned about hate crime because she objected to a law related to gender identity in Spain, and Carmen Calvo, the Deputy Prime Minister, who was hung in effigy in Santiago de Compostela just the week before, I think. And this was brought to MSP's attention to try and make the point that this is the atmosphere in which women are trying to discuss their rights. And the Minister promised to meet people, to meet stakeholders, but it won't surprise you to learn that he didn't meet with those women's groups. So then we got to stage 3 in the Parliament, and that's the final stage, which is a chamber debate. And again, further amendments were tabled to the bill on the sex aggravator. Joanne Lamont, the Labour MSP, tried to include a definition of sex, which was in line with the UK Equality Act, where sex is male or female. A removal of people who cross-dress from the definition of transgender identity, and then quite a few amendments of freedom of expression. And this was one of the amendments tabled by the Labour MSP Joanne Lamont. So again, she was trying to get onto the face of the bill that it should not be seen as stirring up hatred again on the basis of transgender identity, where you were saying that sex was a physical binary characteristic, terms woman and man related to their sex, and so on. So again, on the face of it, a very uncontroversial thing to say. However, the night before, 2 days before the debate, the leading LGBT activist group in Scotland sent a briefing round to MSPs, and they referred specifically to this amendment. And we were very struck by the response to this, where they spoke about these words in Joanne's amendment were fundamentally undermining trans people's rights, that it was saying that trans people's rights were an open season for attack. So it sort of laid bare, almost in a way, what we were up against. And I'm going to end with this, but the story ends that the bill did pass with overwhelming support. The Conservatives did not vote for the bill, and a handful of Labour MSPs, female MSPs, did not vote for the bill, and one female SNP MSP did not vote for the bill. But in closing her speech, Joanne Lamont from the Labour Party, and the debate was very, very charged, very emotional. And these were some of her closing words. And if we've got time, I'll play them on a link if you like. Let me just see if this works.
And I'll finish on this final point, on Amendment 11B. This amendment provides a clear point of reference in the face of the law for those taking part in debates on sex and gender identity. It puts beyond doubt that certain things should not be treated as being abusive or threatening under the law based simply on their content. Those things are asserting or advancing or rejecting any proposition which follows from the view that sex is physical, binary characteristic that cannot be changed, that the terms woman, man and related terms refer to sex as such a characteristic, and that a person's sex may be relevant to that person's experience or relevant to other persons. You have had a briefing about this amendment from the Equality Network, and it calls this an unnecessary laundry list. What are we women like with our laundry lists? An unnecessary laundry list of matters relating specifically to transgender identity that, quote, includes propositions that fundamentally undermine trans people's long-established rights. A list of approved statements that include attacks on the fundamental rights of one group of people that says that trans people's rights are open season for attack. That is the interpretation of the Equality Network of what other people would regard as an entirely reasonable, legal, logical, sensible thing to say. That there are two sexes. That we are entitled to say that is described as a fundamental attack on the rights of one group of people. Well, I say sex is a physical, binary characteristic that cannot be changed. The terms woman and man refer to sex as such a characteristic, and a person's sex may be relevant to that person's experience or relevant to other persons. Colleagues, we have a choice. Give women the protection they need to talk about their reality, in ordinary words, safely. Or to endorse the view that just talking about this reality and what it means to them, in their own words, is of itself some form of attack, something to be condemned. I know what my choice is. It is the one that will let me leave this Parliament, knowing that I fought right to the end for women's rights, including the most basic right of all, the right for women to name these in their own terms. And I urge people to support the amendments in my name, and particularly to support the amendment in Joan McAlpine's name.